Most people are taught a simple idea early in life. If you work hard, stay disciplined, and keep showing up, things will eventually work out. And for a long time, that idea feels true. Effort is rewarded, responsibility is praised, struggle is respected. So the natural conclusion is obvious. If life is still financially difficult, the answer must be more effort. But there is a quiet contradiction hiding beneath that belief. All around us are people who work relentlessly, long hours, few breaks, constant pressure. They do everything that is expected of them, and often more. Yet year after year, their financial position barely changes, not because they are careless, not because they lack intelligence, and not because they avoid responsibility. They are doing exactly what they were told would work. This creates a deep and uncomfortable tension. If hard work is the path to security, why does security feel so fragile for those who work the hardest? Why does exhaustion increase while freedom stays distant? And why does questioning this idea feel almost wrong, as if doubting effort itself is a moral failure? The issue is not that hard work has no value. It is that effort alone is often mistaken for a financial strategy, and once that mistake settles in, it quietly shapes decisions for decades. Time is traded for stability. Stability slowly turns into limitation, and the system continues, not because it is effective, but because it feels familiar. Understanding this is not about rejecting work. It is about understanding why effort, when placed inside the wrong structure, can lead to a life that feels busy, responsible, and endlessly constrained at the same time. At the center of this issue is a misunderstanding so common that it rarely gets questioned. The belief is not simply that work leads to income, but that more effort automatically leads to more progress. Over time, effort becomes the main lens through which financial success is judged. If someone is struggling, the assumption is that they are not doing enough, not trying hard enough, or not sacrificing enough. This way of thinking feels logical because effort is visible. It can be measured in hours, fatigue, and consistency. Systems, on the other hand, are mostly invisible. They operate quietly in the background, shaping outcomes without demanding attention. Because of this, effort is often credited for success while structure goes unnoticed. When progress happens, it is attributed to hard work. When progress stalls, the response is usually to increase effort, not to examine the system producing the result. Another layer of the misunderstanding is the idea that income and wealth are created through the same process. Income is often tied directly to time, compliance, and reliability. Wealth, however, responds to positioning, ownership, and leverage. When these two are treated as interchangeable, people spend their most flexible years optimizing for income while assuming wealth will naturally follow. In many cases, it does not. There is also a moral dimension that reinforces this confusion. Effort is associated with virtue. Struggle is seen as honorable. Ease, by contrast, can feel suspicious, even undeserved. As a result, systems that reduce effort or detach income from constant labor are often dismissed as unrealistic or unethical without being fully understood. This emotional bias makes it difficult to question the framework itself. Over time, this misunderstanding becomes self-reinforcing. When effort is rewarded in small, immediate ways, it strengthens the belief that effort is the correct lever. Promotions, praise, and short-term stability all validate the approach. What is less visible is the long-term trade-off being made. As effort increases, available time decreases. As time decreases, the ability to redesign one's position quietly disappears. The most subtle part of this misunderstanding is that it rarely feels like a mistake. It feels like responsibility. It feels like maturity. It feels like doing the right thing. And because it feels right, it often goes unexamined, even when the results no longer align with the expectations that created it. The trap rarely appears suddenly. It forms slowly, through reasonable choices made under familiar pressures. In the early stages, effort is rewarded just enough to confirm the existing belief. Extra hours lead to small gains. Reliability brings stability. Consistency produces modest improvements. At this point, the system feels fair. Progress may be slow, but it is visible, and that visibility reinforces trust in the process. As time passes, those early rewards begin to shape behavior. Effort becomes the default response to every challenge. When costs rise, more hours are added. When expectations increase, personal capacity is stretched further. The solution is almost always internalized as a personal responsibility problem rather than a structural one. The question becomes how to manage time better, not whether time should be the primary input at all. Gradually, life fills in around this pattern. Commitments accumulate, financial obligations become fixed. Dependence on steady income grows stronger, not because of excess, but because of predictability. Flexibility begins to shrink, but it does so quietly. Nothing feels wrong in isolation. Each decision makes sense on its own. Together, they begin to form a closed loop. What makes this trap especially effective is that it is reinforced by external validation. Being busy is socially rewarded. Being exhausted is often interpreted as being important. Reliability becomes an identity. Saying yes becomes easier than questioning the structure that requires constant yeses. Over time, the absence of spare time is no longer seen as a warning sign, but as proof of responsibility. Another subtle shift occurs during this phase. The future starts to feel abstract, while the present feels urgent. Immediate demands crowd out long-term thinking, not by force, but by priority. When energy is fully consumed by maintaining stability, there is little left for redesigning the underlying system. The idea of stepping back to reassess feels risky, even indulgent, because stability now depends on continuous output. This is where the trap tightens. The more effort that is invested, the harder it becomes to step away from it. Time is no longer a resource to be allocated, it is fully assigned. Income becomes dependent on presence, and presence becomes non-negotiable. The system does not collapse, but it does harden. What once felt temporary begins to feel permanent. Importantly, this process is not driven by poor decisions or lack of discipline. It is driven by alignment with a framework that prioritizes short-term certainty over long-term optionality. Each choice reduces uncertainty in the moment while increasing dependency over time. The trade-off is rarely acknowledged because the costs are delayed and the benefits are immediate. Eventually, a quiet realization emerges. Despite years of consistent effort, the margin for change has narrowed. Growth feels capped. Freedom feels postponed indefinitely. The structure that once provided safety now demands constant maintenance. At this stage, working harder no longer produces meaningful progress, but stopping feels impossible. The persistence of this pattern is not accidental. It is supported by deeply rooted psychological forces that make effort-based living feel not only safe, but necessary. Long before financial outcomes are evaluated, personal identity becomes tied to behavior. Being dependable, busy, and productive forms a sense of self that is difficult to separate from daily action. When effort becomes part of identity, questioning it feels like questioning one's worth. There is also a powerful comfort in predictability. Systems that reward time and compliance offer immediate clarity. Work is assigned, tasks are completed, and compensation follows in a familiar sequence. Even when the outcome is limited, the process itself reduces uncertainty. By contrast, systems that rely on leverage, delayed rewards, or abstract value creation introduce ambiguity. For many people, ambiguity feels more threatening than stagnation. Fear plays a quiet role as well. Not the dramatic fear of failure, but the subtler fear of stepping outside what is socially validated. Hard work is widely accepted as responsible behavior. Striving within established structures attracts approval, while deviation invites scrutiny. This creates a psychological incentive to remain visible in one's effort, even when that effort no longer produces meaningful advancement. Another important factor is cognitive exhaustion. Sustained effort consumes mental resources. When most attention is spent maintaining obligations, the capacity for strategic thought diminishes. Reflection requires spare energy, and spare energy becomes scarce in systems designed around constant output. As a result, people often default to familiar actions not because they are optimal, but because they are cognitively accessible. There is also a tendency to overvalue what is immediately measurable. Hours worked, tasks completed, and income received provide clear feedback. Structural progress, on the other hand, is slow and often invisible in the early stages. Because the human mind favors quick confirmation, it naturally gravitates toward actions that provide instant signals of usefulness. This reinforces behaviors that feel productive in the short term, even if they limit long-term growth. Social comparison further strengthens the pattern. When peers are equally busy and equally constrained, the situation feels normal. Shared exhaustion becomes a bonding mechanism. Questioning the structure then risks social separation, which many people avoid unconsciously. It is easier to accept collective limitation than to navigate individual uncertainty. Perhaps the most influential psychological factor is loss aversion. Once a certain level of stability is achieved, the possibility of losing it feels heavier than the potential upside of change. Even small disruptions are perceived as significant threats. This bias causes people to protect the existing system, even when that system no longer serves their long-term interests. Over time, these psychological forces create a closed loop. Effort reinforces identity, identity resists change, exhaustion limits reflection, stability discourages experimentation. None of this requires conscious decision-making. It operates automatically, shaping behavior beneath awareness. When effort remains the primary strategy for long enough, its consequences begin to surface quietly. They do not arrive as sudden failures, but as gradual constraints that narrow what is possible. At first, these limits are easy to ignore. Life continues to function, bills are paid, responsibilities are met. From the outside, everything appears stable. Yet, beneath that stability, flexibility is steadily eroding. One of the earliest consequences is the emergence of an invisible ceiling. Progress continues, but only within a narrow range. Income may increase, but it does so incrementally and predictably. Each gain requires a proportional increase in time, energy, or responsibility. Over years, this creates a sense of motion without momentum. Time, in this framework, becomes the most constrained resource. Because income depends on presence and output, absence carries a cost. Opportunities that require patience, experimentation, or delayed returns feel increasingly inaccessible. Even when they are recognized, they are often postponed indefinitely. Another long-term consequence is increased fragility. Systems built on constant effort tend to lack buffers. When income is tightly linked to continuous work, any disruption becomes significant. Health issues, economic shifts, or unexpected responsibilities carry outsized impact. There is also an emotional cost that accumulates slowly. Sustained effort without proportional progress leads to a deeper weariness that comes from repetition without transformation. Motivation becomes harder to access, not because ambition is gone, but because the system offers little room for renewal. Over time, perspective narrows. When most energy is spent maintaining what already exists, curiosity about alternative paths fades. New ideas feel impractical. Change feels disruptive. The mind adapts to optimization within constraints, rather than questioning the constraints themselves. Perhaps the most profound consequence is the shifting relationship with freedom. What once felt like a distant goal slowly turns into an abstract concept. Choices become reactive rather than intentional. Life becomes a sequence of managed obligations rather than a direction consciously shaped. The shift that changes everything does not begin with action. It begins with reinterpretation. The same behaviors, viewed through a different lens, reveal a different set of priorities. What was once seen as dedication can be seen as dependence. What was once seen as security can be seen as fragility. At the center of this shift is a redefinition of effort. Effort stops being treated as a virtue in itself and begins to be understood as a tool. Tools are valuable, but only in the right context. Used without structure, even the most powerful tools produce limited results. Another part of this mental shift involves separating personal value from constant productivity. When worth is tied to output, rest feels undeserved and reflection feels unproductive. When value is decoupled from busyness, space opens for higher level thinking. There is also a change in how risk is perceived. Instead of viewing uncertainty as something to be avoided, it is recognized as a natural component of meaningful change. Stability is no longer treated as an endpoint, but as a temporary state designed to support longer-term direction. Attention begins to move away from intensity and towards structure. Rather than asking how to work harder, the question becomes where effort produces lasting effects. Progress is no longer measured by exhaustion, but by increased optionality. A practical framework begins by changing how situations are evaluated. Instead of asking how much effort something requires, the more revealing question is what continues to exist after the effort stops. Some activities reset to zero the moment attention is withdrawn. Others leave behind residual value that continues to function independently. Within this framework, time-bound exchange is seen clearly for what it is. When income depends on continuous presence, the system demands constant renewal. Time-bound systems are stable but capped. They provide predictability while quietly restricting scale and flexibility. By contrast, systems with continuity allow effort to accumulate rather than expire. Value compounds instead of resetting. Time-bound income becomes a support structure, not the destination. It funds stability while attention is gradually redirected towards systems that persist. Control becomes another key variable. When outcomes depend heavily on external permission or schedules, leverage is low. Systems that increase control tend to reduce volatility over time, even if they introduce uncertainty at the beginning. Attention is treated as a finite resource. Maintenance preserves existing structures, creation builds new ones. A practical framework limits how much cognitive space maintenance occupies so that creation remains possible. Direction replaces intensity as the primary measure of progress. Intensity increases output. Direction determines whether that output leads somewhere meaningful. Evaluation becomes structural rather than emotional, based on whether decisions expand future options or reduce them. This framework operates incrementally. Small reallocations of time and attention accumulate. Effort begins to feel lighter, not because less is required, but because its effects last longer. Progress becomes less fragile. Choices expand instead of narrowing. Hard work has never been the problem. It has always been a source of dignity, stability, and meaning. The issue is the expectation placed on it. When effort is asked to solve structural problems, it quietly carries a weight it was never designed to hold. Many people do everything they are told to do. They stay disciplined. They remain consistent. And yet, over time, they sense a growing gap between how much they give and how much freedom they gain. That gap is not a personal failure. It is a signal that the framework guiding their effort may be incomplete. Clarity often arrives through observation. By noticing what effort produces and what it does not, patterns emerge. Some actions preserve stability. Others expand possibility. Confusion arises when one is expected to do the work of the other. This understanding does not demand urgency or radical change. It invites patience. When effort is placed inside systems that extend beyond the present moment, its character changes. It stops being consumed by repetition and starts contributing to continuity. In the end, progress is not defined by how hard life feels, but by how much room it creates. And that room is rarely built through effort alone,